to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we're going to be breaking down the UCF versus Florida post-game matchup with some quick analysis and just my overall general thoughts of how the game turned out. And, I'll be the first one to admit on this show, I think you always, as a analyst or just a college football guy in general, I try to be as unbiased as I can, but I'll be objective and say, yeah, there are a handful of teams in college football that I tend to be a little bit biased about, but at the same time too, I think deep down everybody does have some bias in some way. And I've been covering Florida extensively on this channel even before I started this show. Florida Gators were the main team I was covering and following their spring training and and following the coaching staff and all the recruiting along the way. And so far, my takeaway from this Florida game as I was watching it is that there were a handful of things that I think they really deserve credit on. And, the first thing I said to myself is, Billy Napier and Florida desperately needed this win. I mentioned it in my analysis in last week when we were calling about UCF, but it was to the point where I don't know if you necessarily would have got fired if any of this happened, but I think the first thing that kind of comes to mind is, okay, if you lose this game, the entire city of Gainesville is going to be coming after you, and it just gets to a point where you can only have the same sort of conversations over and over again in terms of, oh, when's Napier getting fired? Oh, who are they bringing in? Oh, what are they going to do next? What are they going to do with Lagway? But I would argue that this was more of a complete game for Florida than Mississippi State was. And I'm going to articulate that for a couple of reasons. I believe for the most part, Graham Mertz was a large reason of why they won that game. Now on the stat, I said on the show that it would be a high-scoring game and Graham Mertz should minimum throw for 250 or 300 yards, which obviously was inaccurate to some extent. But I think what Billy Napier has done a good job at that I don't think he gets enough credit for is he knows how to get the most out of Graham Mertz. And I mentioned this before, that the intermediate throws, the play action, they were really maximizing that too. But what I was really impressed with Graham Mertz is being able to handle things under pressure. And I think Napier has definitely deserved criticism for some of the conservative play calling that he has. And I'll be the first one to admit, yeah, 100%, you see it all the time. But when you had that sort of those offensive line issues and the younger receivers, to some extent it was necessary. But when I was watching this game, I think Florida's offensive line did a phenomenal job at really being able to contain this UCF defensive line who, for the most part has struggled getting to the quarterback, which was a really strong sign. And when they did get some pressure, Graham Mertz showed off enough athletic ability to be able to get away from the pressure. He's able to find Montrell Johnson, Elijah Badger, and a couple of those guys to the point where he was able to keep moving drives forward and most importantly being in situations where it was third and manageable, the 3rd and 2s, the 3rd and 3s, getting those screen plays out. And I've been saying this over and over again, finally getting Montrell Johnson as part of the receiving game. There were a lot of great examples of just feeding Montrell Johnson the football and let him break a couple tackles and get those 8 to 10 yard chunk plays that ultimately was one of the many reasons why Florida won that game. And when Florida came out and had a really excellent drive to start the game, it definitely got things excited, popping down at the Swamp too, and well warranted too. I think for the most part the defense really did a strong job at eliminating a lot of those electric plays that I mentioned in my preview versus Colorado, which by the way, I was totally inaccurate about, but more to come on that in a second. But what Florida defensively did a great job at was not letting RJ Harvey and KJ Jefferson get into a rhythm. Because when I've been watching UCF these past couple weeks, the biggest thing I saw is just how quickly in the snap of a finger it's okay, one big play, boom, another big play, boom, and so on and so forth too. And I mentioned statistically, yes, they're one of the best rushing attacks in this entire country, and I was hammering my fist saying that UCF was going to whoop Colorado and they are one of the top 25 teams in the country. But up to this point, they've completely crumbled against Colorado and Florida. I mean, KJ Jefferson just does not seem comfortable back there. A lot of the reads that he's been getting has been inconsistent. Throwing for less than 150 yards passing, and quite frankly, it's got to a point where if Florida was able to even just remotely slow down RJ Harvey, I was definitely a little taken back by his performance this week against Florida, because he's played a lot of SEC teams before. He's an experienced veteran, and I definitely expect a lot more out of that. And when you also say to yourself too, another thing that's worth mentioning about it was there was definitely some interesting play calling by Gus Malzahn, particularly in the fourth quarter, where UCF pretty much ran the ball the entire time and chewed up about 8 minutes of clock just to get a field goal. And yes, is UCF's primary weapons, the best thing about them is their rushing attack. Yes, 100%. But you get to a point where you've pretty much, Florida's been smacking you around this entire game. You get to a point where you just kind of have to be a little bit more aggressive and trust your playmakers to be able to get down to the field and score a quick touchdown, try to get back into it. And it was definitely maybe not a statement win for Florida, but going into what's now going to be their toughest matchups ahead, I think for most importantly, it buys some breathing room for Billy Napier. I think it shows too that, even when DJ Lagway had a couple moments in that game too, he was lighting it up out there. He threw a really nice about 35 yard pass. I think it was in the second or third quarter. And when you see, I saw his tape too, even before he came to Florida, and I'm well aware of the talent that he has, even though I've been saying that Mertz should be the starter still. But I'm telling you, it's a great problem to have, to see Mertz and Lagway together like that, because when both of them get going too, yes, can the play calling be a little bit conservative? Could we see some riskier throws here and there? Absolutely too. But I think moving forward with this throughout the rest of the season, I think there's a couple things that I think we should be looking out for if you're talking about the Florida Gators in particular. I think first and foremost, one of the things I'm going to be asking myself is how much is Napier going to be able to adapt to some of the defenses that they're going to be coming up against? Because although I did say that Florida did play the most complete game that they have all season, which is true, that offensive production is not going to be good enough versus the Georgias, the Alabamas, and versus those kind of caliber teams that they're going to be up against, and that's just the reality of it. And so, to what extent can they get a little bit more aggressive, and to what extent can you put Graham Mertz in situations where you can let him take a couple more risks too? Because I think he's shown enough to this point where you don't have to worry about the turnover proneness that he had at Wisconsin compared to now. He's a lot more poised. He's better at getting through his progressions, and quite frankly, I think his mechanics were a lot smoother. And I think you saw a lot of those examples as you were watching the UCF game too. I think secondarily, Florida deserves a lot of credit for their rushing defense, which was definitely one of the biggest stains for him this entire season. Because I, mentioned this before when previewing the game that Texas A&M went down last week, or not last week, a couple weeks ago when they played him, and they had a 99-yard drive and essentially ran the ball the entire time. Which obviously, if you're UCF, yes, if your strength is having a 3-man rushing attack plus KJ Jefferson, and you've seen that Florida has been struggling with stopping the run, then yes, obviously that should be your game plan, is to attack them with the jet sweeps, with the RPOs, and with the counters to try and spread the field. And you're definitely I was definitely a little surprised some of the UCF play calling that I saw, because they went from being a top 25 team a couple weeks ago to now being kind of just the middle of the pack, and now any hopes of them winning the Big 12 are probably essentially over at this point, given how close and competitive the Big 12 has become. But when you look at Florida defensively, I think defensive line definitely deserves some credit for being able to put KJ Jefferson in enough situations where when he did pass that he was hurried and looked uncomfortable. We're going to have to see more of that. I think the secondary is going to have to still, yes, it's a work in progress, and you have some concerns with the secondary, particularly the safeties and all that stuff too. But I think it's most importantly, this is an example of the team right now moving in the right direction. I think for the most part, when you think about this game, this could have been a statement win for UCF in the sense of, okay, yeah, we had that screw up game versus Colorado, but we came into Florida's home field and beat him at Ben Hill and beat him at the Swamp. I mean, that would have been that's one of those games where if you win a game like that, you're building momentum for the rest of the season. And when you look at Florida full picture, I think there's still a lot of reason to be optimistic. Now, granted, there's going to be some moments in time where I think we're still going to see some pain points, and I think the weaknesses of Florida are still there. But if we can see some more adaptability in terms of some of the personnel changes that we're making, in terms of some of the play calling, and maybe even taking a couple more chances at being aggressive, like we saw versus UCF, maybe not all hope is lost with Florida. I think yes, UCF has definitely been a little bit disappointing up these past couple weeks, but Florida deserves credit for this win. They came out and yeah, they didn't light up the scoreboard offensively, but they didn't make as many mistakes as they usually do. For the most part, a lot of the penalties that they did weren't too consequential. They were just pretty much just basic calls, and I talked about it before how undisciplined Florida has been, but you really didn't see that as much this game, or at least to some extent. Maybe the win is kind of glossing that over, but all in all, Florida should be happy about this win. It takes away some pressure from Billy Napier as they go through this SEC gauntlet, and it will definitely tell what kind of team Florida is. Is it just Florida beating teams that they should be beating, or has this team turned the corner to